September 14, 1944. Kummersdorf Proving Grounds, 40 kilometers south of Berlin. Hauptmann Klaus Becker stood beside a machine that made no sense according to everything German armor doctrine taught. The M18 Hellcat tank destroyer sat in the morning sun, its long 76mm gun angled skyward, its armor so thin Becker could see light through the bullet holes. American infantry had punched through the hull before abandoning it near Aachen 3 weeks earlier. The vehicle had been transported to Kummersdorf under strict secrecy, one of several captured American armored vehicles brought to Germany's primary testing facility for evaluation. Becker, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had commanded Panzer IVs at Kursk and Panthers at Normandy, had been assigned to lead the testing program. His orders were explicit: determine the tactical capabilities and weaknesses of this American tank destroyer so German units could develop effective counter-tactics. What Becker discovered over the following 3 days would force him to write the most troubling report of his military career. A report that would be classified immediately upon reaching Berlin, a report that concluded with words no German armor officer wanted to admit. This vehicle represents a tactical philosophy we cannot match with current doctrine or existing designs. The Hellcat weighed 18 tons. Becker's Panther weighed 45 tons. The Hellcat's armor ranged from 1/4 inch to 1 inch thick. The Panther's armor was 3 inches thick on the front glacis. By every measure German doctrine considered important, protection and firepower balanced against acceptable mobility, the Hellcat should have been inferior. It sacrificed everything for speed, mounting armor so light that German anti-tank rifles could penetrate it at close range. Yet as Becker reviewed American after-action reports captured along with the vehicle, he found something that didn't align with German assumptions. This supposedly vulnerable tank destroyer had an operational kill ratio exceeding 2 German tanks destroyed for every Hellcat lost. The Americans called it the Hellcat, a name painted on many vehicles alongside cartoon images of snarling cats wielding guns. The official designation was M18 GMC, gun motor carriage. Development had begun in 1942, when American armor doctrine was still recovering from the shock of German tactical superiority demonstrated in North Africa. The initial American response to German armor had been predictable: build heavier tanks with thicker armor and bigger guns. But the M18 represented a different philosophy entirely. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The design brief was radical by conventional standards: maximum speed, minimum weight, sufficient firepower to destroy any German tank, and armor thick enough only to stop shell fragments and small arms fire. The designers accepted that the M18 could not survive a direct hit from German tank guns. Instead of trying to withstand enemy fire, the Hellcat would avoid it entirely through speed and maneuverability. Strike fast, kill the target, disappear before the enemy could respond. German armor philosophy had evolved along entirely different lines. The experience of the Eastern Front, where vast distances and massive Soviet tank formations dominated, had convinced German designers that armor protection was paramount. The Panther, which entered service in 1943, embodied this philosophy. Heavy frontal armor sloped to maximize deflection, a powerful 75mm gun capable of destroying Soviet T-34 seconds at long range, and sufficient mechanical reliability to operate across the expansive Russian steppes. The Panther's top speed on roads was approximately 30 miles per hour, 25 miles per hour, cross-country under ideal conditions. This was considered acceptable because German doctrine emphasized defensive positions, prepared firing positions where Panthers could use their superior armor and firepower to destroy approaching enemy tanks. Mobility was important, but protection and killing power took priority. When Becker climbed into the Hellcat's driver position on the morning of September 15th, he immediately noticed differences. The interior was cramped but efficient. Controls were simple, almost crude by German standards. The transmission was automatic, requiring no clutch operation, something German tankers found bizarre. How could a driver properly control a tank without a manual transmission? But when Becker started the 9-cylinder radial engine and engaged the transmission, understanding began to dawn. The Hellcat accelerated like nothing he had driven before. From stationary to 30 miles per hour took less than 30 seconds. The vehicle handled like a racing car, responsive to steering inputs, stable despite the speed. Becker pushed the accelerator further. 40 miles per hour, 45. The proving ground's main road stretched ahead, 2 miles of straight pavement normally used for speed trials. 50 miles per hour. The Hellcat was still accelerating. At 55 miles per hour, Becker eased off the throttle, not because the vehicle had reached its limit, but because he had. The sensation was unlike any armoured vehicle he had commanded. Panthers felt powerful but ponderous, requiring deliberate inputs and patient manoeuvring. The Hellcat felt alive, agile, almost reckless. Becker brought the vehicle to a stop and sat for a moment, considering what he had just experienced. A fully armed tank destroyer capable of 55 miles per hour on roads, 40 miles per hour cross-country, according to captured American performance specifications. The implications were profound. Oberleutnant Werner Schultz, Becker's second-in-command, and Aleyade Deposend Calls, veteran of the Panzer Lehr Division, took his turn driving the Hellcat that afternoon. His reaction was recorded in Becker's notes. "It is less a tank destroyer than a mechanized ambush. One cannot fight this vehicle the way we fight enemy armor. It refuses to engage on our terms. By the time we acquire it as a target and train our guns, it has already fired and repositioned. Our tactical doctrine has no effective counter." The testing program expanded over the following days. Becker's team conducted mobility trials across varied terrain, comparing the Hellcat's performance against captured Soviet T-34 seconds, against German Panzer IVs, and most importantly, against a Panther that served as the baseline for German armor capabilities. The results were documented meticulously, photographed extensively, and analyzed with growing unease. On soft ground, where Panthers often struggled with their weight, the Hellcat maintained speed and maneuverability. In forests, where German tanks had to navigate carefully between trees, the Hellcat slipped through gaps that would have stopped heavier vehicles. On roads, the speed differential was even more pronounced. A Panther traveling at top speed covered 30 miles per hour, the Hellcat covered 55. Over a 10-mile advance, the Hellcat arrived 11 minutes earlier. In tactical terms, those 11 minutes represented the difference between setting up an ambush or driving into one. Gunnery trials revealed another advantage. The Hellcat's turret, mounted on an open-topped hull to save weight, traversed a complete 360 degrees in under 20 seconds. The Panther's turret required 35 seconds for a complete rotation. When engaging targets that appeared unexpectedly from the flank or rear, the Hellcat could acquire and fire significantly faster. The 76mm gun, while less powerful than the Panther's 75mm, was adequate to penetrate German armor at combat ranges. American armor-piercing ammunition, which Becker tested against a captured Panther hull, punched through side armor with ease and could penetrate frontal armor at ranges under 1,000 meters. The Hellcat was not designed to engage Panthers from the front at long range. It was designed to get to the flanks, where armor was thinner, and kill quickly before German tanks could respond. September 18, 1944, Becker compiled his preliminary findings into a report that landed on the desk of General Major Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Armored Troops. The report's conclusions were stark. The M18 represents a fundamental challenge to our armor doctrine. We have prioritized protection and firepower, accepting reduced mobility as necessary compromise. The Americans have inverted this equation. They accept vulnerability in exchange for speed that makes vulnerability less relevant. Our Panthers cannot catch them. Our defensive positions cannot hold them if they choose to avoid engagement. Our counter-tactics assume enemy armor will advance to meet us. The Hellcat refuses this assumption. Guderian's response, documented in his memoirs published after the war, reflected frustration rather than dismissal. The Americans have the industrial capacity to experiment with radical designs because they can afford failures. We must perfect each design because resources allow few alternatives. That they have created an effective vehicle from principles we would reject is unfortunate but not surprising. American pragmatism often produces results that conventional military thinking would never attempt. The context of this evaluation requires understanding German armor development through 1944. Germany had entered the war with light and medium tanks, Panzer IS, IIs, IIs, and IVs, that were adequate against Polish and French opposition, but increasingly outclassed on the Eastern Front. The appearance of Soviet T-34 seconds and KV-1 second in 1941 shocked German tankers who discovered their guns could barely penetrate Soviet armor, while Soviet guns destroyed German tanks with ease. The German response was predictable. Design heavier tanks with better armor and bigger guns. The Tiger I, entering service in 1942, mounted an 88mm gun and frontal armor up to 4 inches thick. It could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, but it weighed 56 tons, traveled at 23 miles per hour maximum, consumed fuel prodigiously, and required constant maintenance. The Panther, introduced in 1943, attempted to balance protection, firepower, and mobility more effectively. At 45 tons, it was lighter than the Tiger while maintaining excellent armor protection through slope and thickness. Its 75mm gun could destroy most Allied tanks at combat ranges, but mechanical reliability remained problematic. Transmissions failed. Final drives broke. The Panther required skilled crews and extensive maintenance support to operate effectively. By September 1944, Germany was producing approximately 300 Panthers per month, a remarkable achievement given strategic bombing and resource shortages. But this production rate was insufficient to replace losses on both eastern and western fronts. Every Panther destroyed represented weeks of industrial capacity lost. Every experienced crew killed represented training investments that could not be replaced quickly. The attrition mathematics were brutal and unsustainable. The American approach to armor, as exemplified by the Hellcat, rejected German assumptions about protection being paramount. American designers accepted that modern anti-tank guns could penetrate any practical thickness of armor. The German 88mm gun could destroy even the heaviest Allied tanks. Soviet 85mm guns could penetrate American and German armor alike. The protection was impossible to achieve absolutely. Perhaps it made more sense to prioritize not being hit rather than surviving hits. This was the philosophy behind the Hellcat's design. Thin armor, reduced weight. Reduced weight enabled higher speed. Higher speed enabled tactical flexibility that heavy tanks could not match. The vehicle could advance rapidly to firing positions, engage targets of opportunity, and withdraw before enemy artillery or tank fire could respond. It was a hit-and-run vehicle, designed for a mobile, aggressive style of warfare that assumed American forces would generally be attacking rather than defending. German testing at Kummersdorf revealed that this philosophy worked, at least under conditions where the Hellcat's advantages could be exploited. In open terrain, where Panthers could engage at long range with superior optics and guns, the Hellcat was vulnerable. But in close terrain, forests, urban areas, anywhere that prevented long-range engagement, the Hellcat's speed and agility became dominant advantages. Becker's team conducted tactical simulations, positioning the Hellcat against Panther and Panzer IV crews, who were briefed to treat the exercise as combat. The results were troubling. In 12 simulated engagements, the Hellcat achieved first shot capability in 9. German crews reported difficulty tracking the vehicle as it maneuvered. By the time they acquired the Hellcat in their sights, it had already fired and begun moving to a new position. One Panther commander, Lieutenant Friedrich Weber, described his frustration in terms that appeared in Becker's classified report. "We are hunting a ghost. I can see it, hear it, but cannot bring my gun to bear before it vanishes. Our advantage in armor and firepower is meaningless if we cannot force it to engage on our terms. This is not tank combat as we understand it. This is asymmetric warfare where our strengths become irrelevant." The psychological impact of facing vehicles like the Hellcat extended beyond tactical frustration. German armor crews in France and Belgium reported encountering American tank destroyers that appeared suddenly, fired with devastating effect, and disappeared before German forces could coordinate responses. The speed differential meant that American armor could choose when and where to engage, refusing battle when conditions were unfavorable, striking when German forces were vulnerable or unprepared. This was a fundamental inversion of the tactical relationship German doctrine assumed. German training emphasized that heavier, better protected tanks with superior guns would dominate the battlefield by forcing enemy armor to engage at long range, where German advantages in optics and firepower were decisive. German training emphasized that heavier, better protected tanks with superior guns would dominate the battlefield by forcing enemy armor to engage at long range, where German advantages in optics and firepower were decisive. But the Hellcat refused to play this game. It accepted that German tanks were superior in direct combat, so it avoided direct combat entirely. It used speed to dictate engagement terms, to appear where German armor was weak, to strike and vanish before retaliation was possible. This approach violated everything German tankers had learned about armored warfare. The concept of a tank destroyer that prioritized escape over survival seemed almost cowardly by German standards. Real tanks, German doctrine insisted, stood their ground and traded blows until one side was destroyed. The Hellcat's hit-and-run tactics felt dishonorable, unsporting, though Becker was professional enough to recognize that effectiveness mattered more than honor in warfare that had already abandoned most pretense of chivalry. The tactical reports from the Western Front, which Becker reviewed as part of his evaluation, painted a consistent picture. American tank destroyer battalions equipped with Hellcats operated with aggressive independence. They did not advance in formation with infantry. They did not defend fixed positions. Instead, they roved across the battlefield, exploiting gaps in German lines, ambushing supply columns, destroying artillery positions, and engaging German armor only when conditions favored American forces. One report from Panzer Division, dated August 1944 near Chambois during the Falaise pocket fighting, described an encounter that exemplified the Hellcat's tactical employment. A column of Panthers was moving through bocage country, the dense hedgerow terrain of Normandy that limited visibility and restricted maneuver. The column commander, a veteran of the Eastern Front, had positioned his tanks in standard formation, with lead vehicles watching for anti-tank positions, while the main body followed at intervals that prevented clustered targets. The first indication of American presence was the lead Panther exploding as a 76mm round penetrated its side armor. The shot had come from a gap in the hedgerow 300 meters to the right, an opening the Germans had not identified as a firing position. Before the column could respond, before the second Panther could traverse its turret toward the threat, the Hellcat had withdrawn behind the hedgerow and disappeared. The Germans deployed infantry to sweep the area, a process that took 15 minutes. By the time they confirmed the firing position was empty, a second Panther at the rear of the column was burning, hit from a completely different direction. The Hellcat had circled the German position using farm tracks that Panthers were too wide to navigate, engaged from the rear where armor was thinnest, and vanished again before German forces could coordinate a response. The engagement lasted 45 minutes. 2 more Panthers were destroyed, 1 damaged. The Hellcat was never hit, possibly never even acquired as a target by German gunners who were scanning sectors where they expected enemies to appear. This pattern repeated across the Western Front through the fall of 1944. Hellcats appeared in German rear areas, destroyed supply trucks and command vehicles, then escaped before German armor could arrive. They ambushed German tank formations from unexpected angles, killed 1 or 2 vehicles, and withdrew at speeds German tanks could not match. They operated at night, using their superior mobility to reposition between firing points, forcing German forces to defend everywhere simultaneously because the Hellcat could strike anywhere. The psychological toll on German tankers was documented in letters and diaries that were later captured or recovered. Feldwebel Hans Kruger of the 2nd Panzer Division wrote to his wife in October 1944, "We are supposed to be the best tank soldiers in the world, but we cannot catch these American destroyers. They are everywhere and nowhere. We hear the gun, see the flash, and by the time we turn our turret, they are gone. It is like fighting the wind." I am more afraid of these fast Americans than I ever was of Soviet tanks. At least, the Russians stand and fight. Hauptmann Becker's final report, submitted to German High Command on September 23, 1944, included tactical recommendations that revealed how fundamentally the Hellcat challenged German doctrine. Conventional counter-tactics are ineffective. Our standard response to enemy armor, advance to engage with superior firepower and protection, plays directly into the Hellcat's advantages. It wants us to advance because that exposes our flanks and forces us to concentrate on movement rather than observation. It wants us to pursue because our maximum speed is insufficient to catch it. Becker recommended instead a defensive approach that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war, when German armor dominated through aggressive maneuver. Units encountering Hellcats should establish static positions with overlapping fields of fire, forcing the Americans to approach prepared defenses rather than choosing their engagement positions. Infantry anti-tank teams must screen armor against close approaches. Air reconnaissance must be employed constantly to identify Hellcat positions before they can achieve surprise. Most critically, commanders must resist the temptation to pursue. The Hellcat's speed makes pursuit futile and leaves pursuing units vulnerable to additional ambush. These recommendations essentially conceded that German armor could not defeat the Hellcat through superior tactics or equipment. The best German tankers could hope for was to mitigate the Hellcat's advantages by refusing to fight on American terms, by adopting defensive postures that limited the speed and surprise that made the Hellcat effective. It was an admission that tactical initiative had shifted to American forces, that German armor was now reacting rather than acting. The broader context made this shift even more significant. By fall 1944, German armored forces were stretched across three major fronts: the collapsing Eastern Front, where Soviet armies were driving toward Germany itself, the Italian Front, where Allied forces were grinding through defensive lines, and the Western Front, where American and British armies were advancing toward the Rhine. German tank production, despite remarkable achievements given strategic circumstances, could not replace losses at the rate casualties accumulated. Every Panther destroyed by a Hellcat represented irreplaceable industrial capacity. Every experienced crew killed represented training that took months and could no longer be afforded given time and resource constraints. The attrition mathematics were brutal. Germany needed to preserve armored forces for decisive battles that might stabilize the front. Instead, those forces were being worn down in encounters with vehicles like the Hellcat that refused to engage in the decisive armor battles German doctrine expected. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. American production numbers made the comparison even more stark. The United States produced approximately 2,700 Hellcats between July 1943 and October 1944. Production cost was approximately $57,000 per vehicle, roughly one-third the cost of a Sherman tank. The Hellcat was cheap, fast to manufacture, and employed a common powertrain shared with other American vehicles, simplifying logistics and maintenance. If one was destroyed, 3 more were already rolling off assembly lines. German Panthers cost approximately 120,000 Reichsmarks, approximately $48,000 at official exchange rates, though such comparisons became meaningless given wartime currency distortions. But the real cost was measured in specialized components, skilled labor, and production time. Each Panther required components that could not be easily substituted or manufactured rapidly. Each one took weeks to build. Losses could not be replaced quickly even when industrial capacity was available. The fundamental asymmetry was that America could afford to lose Hellcats in tactically unsuccessful engagements because more were always available. Germany could not afford to lose Panthers even in tactically successful battles because replacements were uncertain. This industrial reality shaped tactical options in ways that no amount of crew skill or tactical brilliance could overcome. Becker understood this intellectually, though the emotional acceptance was more difficult. He had commanded Panthers at Kursk in July 1943, the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front, where German armor had faced Soviet defenses in depth and suffered unsustainable casualties despite achieving local, tactical victories. He had seen what industrial capacity meant when the enemy could absorb losses that would cripple German formations. Now he was seeing the same pattern on the Western Front, where American industrial capacity fielded vehicles that German industry could not match in numbers, even when German designs were technically superior. The testing program at Kummersdorf continued through October 1944, though Becker was reassigned to command a Panther company in the defense of Germany before the final reports were completed. His replacement, Major Otto Fischer, conducted additional trials focusing on potential vulnerabilities in the Hellcat design. Fischer's team discovered that the open-topped turret, while reducing weight, made crews vulnerable to artillery airbursts and infantry fire from elevated positions. The thin armor could be penetrated by heavy machine guns at close range. The vehicle's speed was only effective on roads or firm ground. In mud or snow, the Hellcat's ground pressure disadvantage compared to tracked vehicles became apparent. These were real vulnerabilities that German forces could potentially exploit. But exploiting them required creating battlefield conditions that forced Hellcats into disadvantageous positions, and the Americans had shown consistent skill at refusing battle when conditions were unfavorable. Fischer's report concluded, "The Hellcat's weaknesses are theoretical rather than practical. In actual combat, American crews avoid situations where these vulnerabilities become relevant. They use speed and tactical flexibility to operate only under conditions that favor their vehicle's strengths." The German army attempted to develop doctrine to counter the Hellcat threat through the winter of 1944 and 45. Training manuals were updated to emphasize anti-ambush tactics, constant movement to prevent American reconnaissance from establishing Hellcat firing positions, and immediate infantry deployment when Hellcats were encountered to exploit their vulnerability to close-range fire. But these counter-tactics required resources Germany no longer possessed in adequate quantities. Infantry units that could screen armor were increasingly committed to holding defensive lines against Soviet advances in the east. Fuel shortages limited the constant movement that might prevent American ambushes. Air reconnaissance that could spot Hellcat positions was impossible when the Luftwaffe had been swept from the skies by overwhelming Allied air power. The counter-tactics were sound in theory, but unexecutable in practice given Germany's deteriorating strategic situation. By December 1944, when Germany launched the Ardennes offensive that became known as the Battle of the Bulge, the Hellcat's impact was evident in American defensive responses. Tank destroyer battalions equipped with Hellcats were positioned to respond rapidly to German breakthrough attempts. Their speed allowed them to redeploy faster than German armor could exploit gaps in American lines. At Street, Vith, Hellcats from the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion engaged advancing German armor from ambush positions, destroyed multiple vehicles, and withdrew before German forces could bring superior numbers to bear. The engagement pattern that German testing at Kummersdorf had identified, the Hellcat's refusal to engage in sustained combat and its preference for hit-and-run tactics, was exactly what American crews executed in actual battle. German tankers found themselves fighting an enemy that would not stand and die, that chose speed over honor, that prioritized mission effectiveness over the romantic notion of armored duels that German tactical culture still valued despite years of brutal warfare that had stripped away most illusions. Oberleutnant Werner Schulz, Becker's former second-in-command who had driven the captured Hellcat at Kummersdorf, encountered American tank destroyers during the Ardennes fighting. His Panther company was advancing through the Belgian forest near Bastogne, when Hellcats, from positions they had bypassed, engaged the German column from behind. Schulz later described the engagement in a post-war interview conducted by American historians in 1952. "We thought we had cleared the area. Our reconnaissance reported no enemy armor, but the Hellcats had let us pass, then hit our supply column following behind. By the time we reversed course to engage them, they were gone. We found 3 trucks burning, ammunition exploding, our supplies destroyed. The Hellcats had vanished. We searched for an hour and found nothing. It was exactly what we had predicted at Kummersdorf. Speed made them untouchable. Our Panthers were powerful but blind. The Americans were everywhere we were not. The psychological impact Schultz described was widespread among German armored forces in the war's final months. The sense of tactical helplessness, of facing an enemy that could not be brought to battle on favorable terms, corroded morale in ways that direct combat did not. German tankers had proven repeatedly that they could match Allied armor in direct engagements, that their training and equipment were competitive when battles occurred under conditions German doctrine preferred. But the Americans increasingly refused those conditions. They used speed and tactical flexibility to operate in ways German armor could not counter, to impose a style of warfare that rendered German advantages in protection and firepower less relevant. It was asymmetric warfare, though that term would not be widely used until decades later. The Hellcat, with its radical emphasis on mobility over protection, represented a different philosophy of armored combat, one that accepted vulnerability as the price of speed, that chose first strike capability over survivability, that prioritized operational tempo over tactical security. This philosophy was uniquely American in important ways. It reflected industrial confidence, the knowledge that losses could be replaced. It reflected strategic optimism, the belief that offensive action was preferable to defensive caution. It reflected cultural pragmatism, the willingness to abandon conventional wisdom if unconventional approaches produced better results. German military culture, shaped by centuries of European warfare traditions and decades of professional military development, found this American approach almost incomprehensible. How could a serious military accept armor so thin it could be penetrated by machine guns? How could crews be expected to operate vehicles where survival depended on not being hit rather than withstanding hits? The questions revealed fundamental differences in how the two nations understood warfare, risk, and the value of individual soldiers' lives. Germany, fighting for survival by late 1944, had adopted an attritional mindset where every soldier and every vehicle was expected to extract maximum cost from the enemy before being destroyed. America, fighting a war of industrial mobilization with confidence in ultimate victory, could afford to prioritize crew survival and vehicle preservation, could design systems that emphasized avoiding casualties rather than accepting them as inevitable. The Hellcat embodied this difference. It was designed assuming that if crews were skilled and the vehicle was fast enough, they could fight entire campaigns without being hit. This assumption proved largely correct. Hellcat loss rates in the European theatre were significantly lower than equivalent German tank destroyer losses, despite the Hellcat's minimal armor protection. The reason was simple. Vehicles that moved at 55 miles per hour and chose their engagement positions were harder to hit than vehicles that moved at 30 miles per hour and fought from static positions. Post-war analysis by the United States Army Armor School at Fort Knox examined Hellcat combat performance across the European campaign. The final report, published in 1948, documented that Hellcats achieved an overall kill ratio of approximately 2.4 German tanks destroyed for each Hellcat lost in combat. This ratio was superior to Sherman tanks, superior to most Allied armor, and comparable to German kill ratios despite the Hellcat's fraction of the armor protection German vehicles possessed. The report attributed this success to three factors: superior tactical mobility, allowing engagement, position selection, adequate firepower to penetrate German armor at combat ranges, and crew training that emphasized exploitation of the vehicle's speed advantages. The Hellcat had proven that in modern armored warfare, mobility could be more valuable than protection, that avoiding enemy fire was more effective than absorbing it. For German armor doctrine, this represented a fundamental challenge that Germany lacked time and resources to address. The obvious response would have been developing German vehicles with comparable speed and similar tactical employment. But by late 1944, Germany lacked the industrial capacity for radical design changes. Existing production lines were committed to Panthers, Tigers, and assault guns. Retooling for new designs would have interrupted production at precisely the moment when any production was critical. German industry was instead focused on simplified designs that could be manufactured quickly with limited resources, vehicles like the Jagdpanzer 38 Hetzer that emphasized firepower and minimal cost rather than innovation. The Hetzer was effective within its limitations, but it represented incrementalism rather than the revolutionary thinking that had produced the Hellcat. Germany was trapped by earlier success. The Panther and Tiger had been answers to specific problems, Soviet T-34 seconds and KV-1 second, that outclassed German armor in 1941 and 42. Those designs had been successful, creating vehicles that could dominate Soviet armor in direct combat. But they had locked German industry into production patterns that were difficult to change, even when strategic circumstances shifted and new threats emerged. The Hellcat represented a different path, one that assumed industrial capacity for experimentation, one that accepted that some designs would fail, but that rapid iteration would eventually produce effective vehicles. America had fielded multiple tank destroyer designs through the war, some successful, others less so, continuously refining based on combat experience. This iterative approach required industrial capacity that Germany simply did not possess by 1944, May 8, 1945. The war in Europe ended with Germany's unconditional surrender. Among the thousands of German officers who became prisoners of war was Hauptmann Klaus Becker, captured by American forces in Bavaria after his Panther company was surrounded and ran out of fuel during the final days of fighting. Becker spent 2 years in Allied prisoner of war camps, first in France, then in Britain, before being repatriated to Germany in 1947. During his captivity, he was interviewed multiple times by Allied intelligence officers interested in German tactical assessments of American equipment. In one interview, conducted in December 1945, Becker was asked specifically about the Hellcat testing at Kummersdorf. His response was recorded in the official transcript. "The Hellcat proved that our doctrine was obsolete. We had designed tanks for the war we expected, one where armor and firepower would be decisive. The Americans designed tanks for the war they intended to fight, one where speed and industrial capacity would dominate. They were correct. We were wrong. By the time we understood this, we lacked resources to adapt." The interviewer pressed Becker on whether better German tactics could have countered the Hellcat effectively. Becker's response revealed the depth of Germany's strategic dilemma by war's end. Better tactics require resources we did not have. To counter the Hellcat, we needed constant air reconnaissance to locate them. We needed infantry to screen our armor. We needed fuel to maintain mobility that prevented ambush. We had none of these in adequate supply. The Hellcat exploited our weakness, which was not tactical inferiority but strategic exhaustion. Even our best tanks, our best crews, could not overcome that fundamental disadvantage. Post-war, the Hellcat's influence on armored vehicle design was significant. The concept of highly mobile tank destroyers influenced Cold War American armor doctrine, leading to vehicles like the M56 Scorpion, and eventually to the modern doctrine of mobile anti-tank systems that prioritize speed and firepower over protection. The Soviet Union, which received detailed reports on Hellcat performance through intelligence channels and captured German analysis, incorporated similar thinking into post-war designs that emphasized mobility and gun power for tank destroyers while maintaining heavy armor for main battle tanks. Germany, in its post-war rearmament as West Germany during the Cold War, adopted armor doctrine that blended traditional German emphasis on protection with recognition that mobility had become increasingly important. The Leopard 1 tank, which entered service in 1965, represented a compromise. Adequate armor for protection against contemporary threats, excellent mobility for tactical flexibility, and powerful armament. It was not a Hellcat, but it incorporated lessons that vehicles like the Hellcat had taught about the value of speed in modern armored warfare. In 1978, a symposium on World War II armor was held at the United States Army Armor Center at Fort Knox. Among the attendees was Werner Schulz, the former Oberleutnant who had driven the captured Hellcat at Kummersdorf, and later fought against American armor in the Ardennes. Now a retired Bundeswehr officer and armor instructor, Schulz was invited to speak about German perspectives on American armor design. His remarks, preserved in the symposium proceedings, reflected decades of reflection on lessons learned. The Hellcat represented a truth we did not want to accept, that in modern warfare, The side with industrial capacity to field adequate equipment in overwhelming numbers will defeat the side with superior equipment in inadequate numbers. We Germans prided ourselves on technical excellence, on building the best tanks in the world. But the Americans understood that 50 adequate tanks defeat 10 excellent tanks. The Hellcat was not the best tank destroyer by technical specifications, but it was good enough, and there were thousands of them. That combination proved decisive. Today, at the German Tank Museum in Münster, an M18 Hellcat sits in the American armor section, restored to operational condition. A placard beside it explains the vehicle's specifications and combat record. But the placard does not mention Kummersdorf, does not describe German testing of a captured Hellcat, does not quote Hauptmann Becker's classified report that concluded German doctrine had no effective counter to American speed and tactical flexibility. That story exists in archives, in classified documents that were declassified decades after the war, in the memories of veterans who tested or fought against these vehicles. The story of the Hellcat is ultimately about more than one vehicle's technical specifications or combat record. It is about the collision between different philosophies of warfare, between industrial approaches and traditional military thinking, between accepting vulnerability as the price of speed and insisting that protection must be paramount. The Germans who tested the captured Hellcat at Kummersdorf in September 1944 understood immediately that they were seeing something that challenged fundamental assumptions. A tank destroyer that could reach 55 miles per hour, that could appear anywhere on the battlefield, that refused to fight on German terms. Their reports, classified and buried in archives until decades after the war, revealed a painful truth. German tactical excellence, German engineering superiority, German crew skill, all the advantages that had dominated European battlefields for years, were insufficient against an enemy that combined adequate equipment with overwhelming industrial capacity and tactical doctrine designed to exploit mobility over protection. The Hellcat made Panthers look slow, not because Panthers were poorly designed, but because speed had become more valuable than armor in a war where American forces could choose when and where to engage. The German tankers who wrote those reports understood the implications even as the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion. They had tested the future and found themselves belonging to the past, masters of a doctrine that industrial warfare had rendered obsolete. The Hellcat, light and fast and lethal, represented a new way of armored combat, one where survival depended on not being where the enemy expected, where victory came from speed and surprise rather than frontal assault and superior protection. For German tankers raised in traditions of armored duels and tactical brilliance, this was a difficult truth, but it was truth nonetheless, proven in testing grounds and battlefields, documented in classified reports and combat records, remembered by veterans who had fought against vehicles that moved too fast to catch and hit too hard to ignore. The principle that speed could substitute for armor, that mobility could overcome protection, that industrial capacity could defeat technical excellence, these became fundamental to post-war armor development across all nations. The Hellcat had proven them in combat. The Germans who tested it had confirmed them in analysis. The future of armored warfare belonged to vehicles that moved fast and hit hard, accepting vulnerability as the price of lethality. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. March 23rd, 1944, 28,000 feet above Brunswick, Germany. Captain Walter Beckham of the 352nd Fighter Group has his P-51 Mustang's throttle pushed to the firewall, diving nearly vertical through a sky that's erupting in black blossoms of heavy flak. Each burst throws shrapnel fragments the size of a man's fist through the air at supersonic speeds. One piece through his engine, and he's done. One through his coolant system, and he has maybe 3 minutes before the Merlin seizes. One through the cockpit, and he won't feel anything at all. But Beckham isn't pulling out. He's pushing forward on the stick, steepening the dive, accelerating through 450 miles per hour, then 500, watching his altimeter unwind like a broken clock as the flak bursts multiply around him. Shrapnel pings off his wings, his aircraft shudders as a near miss throws it sideways, and below him, at 15,000 feet, flying in lazy defensive circles inside the protective umbrella of their own anti-aircraft guns, a formation of Messerschmitt Bf-109s from Jagdgeschwader. 3 flies in perfect safety, exactly where German doctrine said they should be, exactly where the Americans were never supposed to follow. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Oberleutnant Heinrich Ehrler and his starful of veteran pilots didn't know was that the American diving toward them had made a calculation that would have seemed insane by any previous standard of fighter combat. Beckham had decided that diving through heavy flak to reach an enemy formation was an acceptable risk, not because the flak wasn't dangerous, it was absolutely lethal, but because the tactical advantage of surprise against pilots who believed themselves safe was worth gambling his life. This wasn't the decision of one reckless pilot. This was the result of a systematic doctrinal revolution that had been developing since the summer of 1943, when American fighter groups began recognizing that their German opponents had one critical vulnerability. The Luftwaffe's most experienced aces, the men with hundreds of victories, the legends who'd been flying since Spain, had developed habits based on their own superiority, and habits could be exploited. The transformation began with a simple observation made by Colonel Donald Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group in July 1943. He'd been studying German tactics through combat reports and interrogations of captured Luftwaffe pilots, and he noticed something peculiar. German fighters consistently broke off attacks when American fighters dove toward them through flak zones, not because they'd lost the tactical advantage, but because diving through heavy anti-aircraft fire violated every principle of self-preservation they'd been taught. German doctrine was precise and had been refined through 5 years of combat across every theatre. Fighter pilots were valuable assets, their training took years, and their experience was irreplaceable. Doctrine explicitly stated that pilots should avoid areas of intense flak, that they should never accept unnecessary risks, that survival of the aircraft and pilot took precedence over achieving a kill. This wasn't cowardice, it was rational resource management. Germany couldn't replace its trained pilots as quickly as they were being lost. But American doctrine was different from the beginning. The United States was training fighter pilots at a rate that exceeded losses by a factor of 3 to 1. New pilots arrived in England every week, already qualified in type, already trained in basic combat tactics. If a pilot was shot down and killed, it was tragic, but operationally, it was sustainable. This fundamental difference in pilot availability led to a fundamental difference in tactical philosophy. By September 1943, American fighter groups were being instructed to actively seek combat inside flak zones. Major General William Kepner, commanding 8 Fighter Command, issued a directive that was revolutionary in its simplicity. German fighters believe flak provides absolute protection. Prove them wrong. Destroy this belief, and you destroy their tactical flexibility. The aircraft made it possible. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was, by 1943 standards, a flying tank. Its radial engine could absorb multiple 20mm cannon hits and continue running. Its pilot sat behind armor plating and a massive engine block that could stop almost any projectile. Flak fragments that would destroy the liquid-cooled inline engines of German fighters would merely punch holes in the Thunderbolt's engine cowling and accomplish nothing. The North American P-51 Mustang, introduced to combat in December 1943, was more vulnerable to flak damage because of its liquid-cooled Merlin engine, but it compensated with speed. A Mustang diving from altitude could exceed 500 miles per hour, spending less than 15 seconds in the heavy flak zone, giving anti-aircraft gunners almost no time to track and adjust. But having the right aircraft wasn't enough. American pilots had to overcome the same survival instincts that protected German pilots. Flying into intense anti-aircraft fire violated every natural impulse. Flak was terrifying in a way that aerial combat wasn't. An enemy pilot you could see, maneuver against, potentially defeat. Flak was random, impersonal, unavoidable. You either flew through it and survived by pure chance, or you didn't. The training began at the replacement training units in England. New pilots arriving from the States underwent an additional phase of instruction before being assigned to operational squadrons. Part of that training, starting in October 1943, involved flying through designated flak practice zones where British anti-aircraft batteries fired timed bursts at specific altitudes. The shells weren't armed, but the psychological effect was identical. Pilots learned what flak looked like, how it formed patterns in the sky, how to judge altitude based on burst characteristics. More importantly, they learned that they could fly through it and survive. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group, who would end the war with 27 victories, described his first flak training flight. "They told us the shells weren't live, but my body didn't believe it. Every burst made me want to turn away. The instructor kept saying, 'Maintain heading, maintain speed, don't give the gunners a predictable target.' After the fifth pass, it stopped feeling like death was certain and started feeling like death was merely probable. That shift, from certain death to probable death, was everything. It created a psychological space where tactical decisions could be made. And once pilots believed they could survive flak, they could be trained to use it as a weapon. The first documented instance of an American fighter deliberately diving through heavy flak to engage German fighters occurred on October 9, 1943, during a mission to Anklam. Major Gerald Johnson was leading 16p47 seconds from the 56th Fighter Group as high cover for a bomber formation. At 26,000 feet, well above the effective range of light and medium flak, the formation was jumped by 12 Bf-109s from Jagdgeschwader 26. The German fighters executed a perfect attack, diving from 30,000 feet with the sun behind them, achieving complete surprise. They made one pass through the bomber formation, destroying 2 B-17 seconds, then dove away to 15,000 feet, where they reformed in a defensive circle, protected by a box barrage of 88mm flak that their own ground controllers had already positioned. Standard American doctrine would have been to reset, climb back to altitude, and wait for the Germans to climb back up for another attack. Instead, Johnson rolled his entire flight inverted and dove straight down through the flak zone. His wingman, Lieutenant Robert Landry, later wrote, "I thought the Major had lost his mind. The flak was so thick you could see the shrapnel glinting in the sun, but he went straight in, and we followed because that's what you did." The Germans never saw them coming. The 109s were in their defensive circle, pilots focused on maintaining formation spacing, watching for American fighters at their altitude or above. No one was looking up at the sky they'd just left. The sky they knew was protected by their own flak. Johnson's flight came screaming down at over 500 miles per hour, far too fast for the anti-aircraft gunners to track effectively, and opened fire at 300 yards. 4 Bf-109s went down in the first 5 seconds. The remaining 8 scattered in complete disarray, abandoning their defensive formation, several flying directly into their own flak in their panic to escape. Johnson's flight pulled out at 8,000 feet, having spent less than 20 seconds in the flak zone. One P-47 had taken shrapnel damage to the tail, but all 16 American fighters returned to base. The mission report Johnson filed that evening was clinical in its assessment. German fighters believe flak provides sanctuary. This belief can be exploited. Within 2 weeks, every fighter group in 8th Air Force had received tactical guidance on engaging enemy fighters inside flak zones. The doctrine was specific: never loiter in the flak, never make multiple passes, dive through at maximum speed, make one attack, and exit. Use altitude to build speed that renders flak tracking ineffective. Accept that some aircraft will be hit. Trust that the tactical surprise will cause disproportionate enemy losses. The psychological impact on German pilots was immediate and profound. Major Gunther Rahl, who commanded the 3rd Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader 11 and would end the war with 275 victories, wrote in his combat diary on November 2, 1943, "The Americans have begun attacking us inside our own flak protection. This should not be possible. Their losses should be unacceptable. But they continue doing it. They trade one of theirs for 3 or 4 of ours and consider this a victory. We cannot fight an enemy who considers such losses acceptable." What Rahl had identified was the core of American tactical philosophy. American commanders were willing to accept a loss ratio that would have been strategically disastrous for Germany. If diving through flak resulted in a 10% loss rate, but caused a 30% loss rate among German fighters, that was considered an overwhelming success. The mathematics were brutal but simple. America could sustain 10% losses indefinitely. Germany could not sustain 30% losses for more than a few months. The tactic evolved rapidly through the winter of 1943 to 44. Fighter groups began coordinating with bomber formations to identify known flak concentrations, then deliberately used those areas as kill zones. If German fighters dove away to seek protection inside flak, American fighters would follow immediately, using their diving speed advantage to close the distance before German pilots could reform their defensive circles. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group, who would achieve 21 air victories before being sent home in April 1944, explained the tactic in a letter to his family. "The Germans are very good pilots, but they've become predictable. When we bounce them, they dive to 10 or 12,000 feet where their flak is heaviest, and they think they're safe. So we follow them down. The flak is just as dangerous for us as it is for them, maybe more so since our Mustangs have coolant systems that don't like shrapnel. But the Germans aren't expecting us. They're watching for flak, not for us. We get 3 or 4 seconds where they're not looking before they realize we're there. That's enough time to kill 3 or 4 of them." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The introduction of the P-51B Mustang to combat operations in December 1943 magnified the effectiveness of this tactic. The Mustang could dive faster than any German fighter could follow without risking structural failure. It could accelerate more quickly out of the dive, meaning it spent less time in the flak zone. And critically, it had the range to conduct these attacks deep inside Germany, where German fighters had previously operated with relative impunity. On March 6, 1944, during the first major American fighter sweep to Berlin, the tactic reached its ultimate expression. Over 600 American fighters, mostly P-51 seconds and P-47 seconds, penetrated to the German capital in waves. German fighter controllers scrambled every available aircraft, over 300 fighters from multiple Jagdgeschwader, and positioned them in defensive formations at medium altitude, 15 to 20,000 feet, protected by concentric rings of heavy flak around the city's vital industrial areas. The Americans didn't attempt to fight around the flak. They dove straight through it. Colonel Hub Zemke, leading the 56th Fighter Group, described the scene. Berlin's flak defences were the heaviest in Germany. The sky over the city looked like a solid wall of black smoke. Our intelligence people said no one could fly through it and survive. So naturally, that's exactly what we did. The Germans had positioned their fighters in what they thought was perfect defensive terrain. We proved theirs. No such thing as perfect defense if your opponent is crazy enough. German records from that day show the complete tactical collapse that resulted. Jagdgeschwader 3 lost 18 fighters without shooting down a single American. Jagdgeschwader 11 lost 22. The kills weren't distributed evenly. Most German aircraft were shot down in the first 30 seconds of combat before they could react to the Americans' presence. They were looking down, watching the bomber formations below them, when American fighters came screaming down from above through their own flak. Oberstleutnant Johannes Steinhoff, who commanded Jagdgeschwader 77 and survived the war to become a general in the post-war Luftwaffe, later provided analysis that was remarkably candid. We had developed tactical doctrine that assumed our opponents would value their lives as much as we valued ours. The Americans didn't. They flew through flak concentrations that should have destroyed them, not because they had better aircraft or better training, but because they had accepted that some percentage of them would die, and they decided that percentage was acceptable if it meant killing more of us. The psychological burden on German pilots became crushing by spring 1944. They could no longer trust that flak provided protection. They could no longer dive away from combat with confidence. Every engagement became a potential trap, where breaking off might lead them directly into the guns of Americans who'd followed them down through what should have been impenetrable anti-aircraft fire. Major Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring fighter ace of all time with 352 victories, almost all on the Eastern Front, flew several missions over Germany in March 1944 as part of a training rotation. He refused to fly any additional missions in the West, stating in his transfer request, "The Americans fight without respect for their own lives. This makes them impossible to predict. I prefer fighting the Soviets, who at least want to survive." The German attempt to counter this tactic failed because it required a fundamental change in pilot psychology that couldn't be trained in time. In April 1944, General Adolf Galland, the general of the fighter arm, issued new tactical directives, instructing German pilots to maintain formations at high altitude rather than diving to medium altitude when attacked. The goal was to force Americans to climb back up for subsequent attacks, rather than allowing them the altitude advantage for their diving attacks. The directive was tactically sound, but it required German pilots to abandon their only reliable defense mechanism. Staying at high altitude meant staying in range of American fighters for longer periods. It meant accepting dogfights at altitudes where the Americans had performance advantages. German pilots, already exhausted and demoralized by 1944, couldn't make this transition. Within weeks, most units had reverted to their previous tactics, diving away to medium altitude when attacked, because at least that gave them the psychological comfort of flak protection, even if that protection was no longer real. The Americans refined the tactic further. By May 1944, fighter groups were conducting low-high-low sweeps. They'd enter German airspace at low altitude, beneath radar detection, then climb to strike altitude just before reaching the target area. This gave them maximum altitude advantage for their diving attacks, while minimizing the time German controllers had to position defending fighters. On May 8, 1944, the 357th Fighter Group executed this tactic to devastating effect over Berlin. They arrived at 32,000 feet, directly above a formation of 40 Bf-109s from Jagdgeschwader, 3 that had positioned themselves at 20,000 feet inside the city's flak defences. The P-51 seconds rolled into a near-vertical dive, accelerating past 520 miles per hour, and opened fire at 12,000 feet, 3 seconds before pulling out. 16 German fighters were destroyed. The surviving pilots, in their debriefings, reported that they'd believed themselves to be completely safe until American fighters materialized out of the flak above them. Several pilots stated they'd initially thought the aircraft diving toward them were German fighters that had lost control. The concept that enemy fighters would deliberately dive through heavy flak to reach them remained psychologically incomprehensible even after experiencing it. Lieutenant Walter Krupinski, an ace with nearly 200 victories who survived the war, was flying that day. His account, recorded in 1986, captures the psychological impact. We were in a perfect defensive position, heavy flak above and below us, fighters positioned to mutual support each other, everything by the doctrine. Then tracers are coming through the flak from above, and 109s are exploding before anyone can react. We scattered, complete chaos, not because we were outnumbered or outfought, but because something impossible had happened. They'd come through the flak. They'd come through our flak, which meant nowhere was safe. That realization, that nowhere was safe, broke something fundamental in German fighter tactics. Throughout May and June 1944, German fighters increasingly refused to engage American escorts. They'd position themselves to attack bombers, see American fighters diving toward them, and withdraw without firing a shot. Better to conserve aircraft and pilots than to accept combat on American terms. The statistics reflected this collapse. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe destroyed 118 American fighters in the West. By June 1944, that number had dropped to 41, despite the fact that American fighter operations had tripled in scope. German fighters weren't becoming less capable, they were becoming less willing to fight. The human cost on both sides was staggering, but asymmetric. The 8th Air Force lost 412 fighter pilots killed between March and June 1944. Of those, 39 were lost to flak while executing diving attacks through defended airspace. That 9% flak casualty rate was considered acceptable, even low, because those diving attacks contributed to the destruction of over 1,000 German fighters during the same period. For Germany, those losses were catastrophic. Each fighter pilot lost represented 9 months to 2 years of training that couldn't be replaced. By July 1944, the average Luftwaffe pilot in the West had fewer than 100 flying hours total and less than 10 hours in type. They were being sent into combat against American pilots with 300 to 500 training hours, plus combat experience, and they were being expected to fight using tactics that required split-second decisions under life-threatening stress. The tactical revolution reached its logical conclusion during the Normandy invasion. American fighters operated over the beachhead with near impunity, despite the presence of over 2,000 anti-aircraft guns. German fighters attempting to attack the invasion fleet would be bounced by American fighters, diving through the flak from above, often before they could even see the ships below them. General-Lieutenant Josef Schmid, commanding Jagdkorps 1 responsible for the defence of France, wrote in his after-action report on June 7, 1944, "Our fighters are operationally combat ineffective, not because of equipment failures, but because of tactical paralysis. Pilots report that American fighters appear from unexpected directions at unexpected times, often from within our own flak zones. This has created a psychological condition where our pilots anticipate ambush from any direction at any time. Combat effectiveness has declined not because pilots lack skill, but because they have lost confidence in any tactical position being defensible. By August 1944, American fighter dominance over Western Europe was absolute. German fighters operated only in small groups, avoiding contact with American escorts, attempting hit-and-run attacks on bomber formations when fighters were absent or distracted. The Luftwaffe had been reduced to guerrilla warfare in their own skies. The tactic of diving through flak to engage enemy fighters was never officially codified in American doctrine because it violated too many safety principles to be written down as policy. No training manual instructed pilots to fly through heavy anti-aircraft fire. No tactical directive explicitly ordered such attacks. But every fighter pilot arriving in Europe after December 1943 was told informally, usually by their squadron commander during their first mission briefing, that if German fighters dove into flak protection, the Americans would follow. Captain John Meyer, who would end the war with 24 victories, explained it succinctly. It wasn't in the manual because it couldn't be. You can't write doctrine that says sacrifice some of your men to kill more of theirs. But everyone understood it. The Germans could have better pilots, better tactics, better aircraft. Didn't matter. We had more of everything, and we were willing to trade our planes and pilots at any ratio that hurt them worse than it hurt us. That's not noble or heroic. That's just math. War math. The German aces who survived the war and later wrote memoirs almost universally identified American tactical aggression, particularly the willingness to accept flak exposure as the decisive factor in the Luftwaffe's defeat in the West. They didn't lose because American pilots were better. Many German accounts acknowledged that. Individually, German aces remained superior in pure flying skill throughout the war. They lost because American pilots fought with institutional times, backing that accepted casualties as an operational cost rather than a strategic crisis. Major Heinz Baer, fourth highest scoring German ace with 220 victories, wrote in 1963, "The Americans did something we could never do. They treated their pilots like ammunition, not with disrespect, but with acceptance that some percentage would be expended in each operation. We couldn't think that way. Each pilot was irreplaceable to us, so we fought to preserve them. They fought to win, regardless of cost. You cannot defeat an opponent who's already accepted his casualties before the battle begins." The legacy of this tactical innovation extended far beyond World War II. During the Korean War, American fighter pilots used similar diving attacks through flak zones to engage MiG-15 seconds that would retreat to sanctuary above Chinese anti-aircraft concentrations along the Yalu River. The tactic remained effective because the North Koreans and Chinese, like the Germans before them, assumed that flak provided practical protection against rational opponents. In Vietnam, the limitations became apparent. Surface-to-air missiles replaced conventional flak, and diving through SAM coverage was genuinely suicidal rather than merely dangerous. American pilots had to relearn tactical patience, waiting for opponents to emerge from protected airspace rather than following them into it. But the underlying principle remained. Accepting exposure to area defenses to achieve surprise against point targets could be tactically decisive if the force ratio favored sustainable losses. Modern air combat doctrine incorporates this lesson through suppression of enemy air defenses operations. Before conducting strikes against protected targets, forces now systematically destroy or suppress anti-aircraft systems, removing the protective umbrella that might allow enemy fighters to operate with impunity. The concept of following an opponent into defended airspace remains, but the execution has shifted from individual pilot aggression to coordinated force application. Captain Walter Beckham, the pilot who opened this story diving through Brunswick's flak on March 23, 1944, pulled out of his dive at 9,000 feet with his Mustang's airframe groaning under 7 G-forces. His gun sight was filled with the enlarged image of Heinrich Oehler's Messerschmitt, which had just begun a desperate break turn after realizing too late that American fighters were among them. Beckham fired a 3-second burst from 200 yards. 50 caliber rounds walked up the 109's fuselage, through the cockpit, and into the engine. The German fighter rolled inverted and fell away, trailing black smoke. Beckham climbed back through the flak he'd just descended through, exiting at 18,000 feet. His Mustang had taken shrapnel hits in the left wing and tail section, 17 holes total, none critical. His flight of 4 had shot down 6 German fighters in 8 seconds of combat. One P-51 had been hit by flak and was streaming coolant, but made it back to England. The tactical exchange ratio was exactly what American doctrine anticipated, acceptable losses producing unacceptable enemy casualties. In his debriefing that evening, Beckham was asked if he'd been afraid diving through the flak. His response was recorded by the intelligence officer and preserved in mission archives. Fear wasn't relevant. The Germans were inside the flak because they thought it made them safe. Proving them wrong was worth the risk. Every time we follow them down and kill them anyway, the next German pilot we face will have that doubt. Eventually, that doubt becomes paralysis. That's when we've won. That psychological calculation, that each successful attack through flak created cumulative demoralization in the opponent, proved accurate. By late 1944, German fighter pilots were receiving explicit instructions from their commanders not to seek refuge in flak zones because American fighters would interpret it as an invitation rather than a barrier. The defensive tool that had protected German fighters since the beginning of the war had been transformed into a trap. The most profound analysis of why this tactic succeeded came not from American sources, but from a post-war interview with General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, conducted in 1956. Galland, who'd commanded all German fighter forces and was himself an ace with over 100 victories, provided an assessment that stripped away nationalism and pride to reveal a harder truth. The Americans understood something about modern warfare that we never fully grasped. They understood that industrial capacity translated directly into tactical freedom. They could afford to lose aircraft and pilots at rates we considered catastrophic because their production and training pipelines exceeded their losses by comfortable margins. This meant they could execute tactics that we knew were dangerous, because danger becomes acceptable when you can replace losses faster than the enemy can inflict them. We fought like we were preserving a finite resource because we were. Every experienced pilot lost was irreplaceable. Every aircraft destroyed took months to replace with our bombed factories. So our tactics emphasized preservation, survival. We would break off combat when conditions turned unfavorable. The Americans wouldn't. They'd follow us anywhere, accept any exchange ratio that favored them numerically, and force us into combat on their terms. They dove through flak, not because they were braver than us, but because their system could absorb the cost of being brave. This structural advantage, invisible in individual dogfights but decisive across thousands of engagements, represented a fundamental revolution in how air warfare functioned. Prior to American involvement, air combat had been partially constrained by mutual recognition that pilots and aircraft were valuable. Both sides avoided fights where losses would be disproportionate to gains. The Americans removed that constraint by accepting that disproportionate losses were sustainable if they achieved strategic objectives. German pilot memoirs from the period after 1944 consistently mention a sense of inevitability, that no matter how skillfully they flew, how perfectly they executed tactics, the Americans would keep coming in numbers that eventually overwhelmed any defense. Major Gunther Rahl, in his autobiography published in 1982, wrote, "By mid-1944, we weren't fighting for victory. We were fighting to survive each mission." The Americans had removed hope from aerial combat. They'd industrialized it, made it a production process where they had infinite raw materials and we had none. The transformation of American fighter tactics from conservative escort duty in 1942 to aggressive offensive hunting by 1944 represents one of the fastest doctrinal evolutions in military history. It happened because American commanders recognized that their advantage wasn't technology or individual pilot skill. It was sustainability. They could fight battles that cost them dearly as long as those battles cost their opponents more. The tactic of diving through flak crystallized this philosophy into a single, repeatable action. Every time an American fighter followed a German into flak protection and emerged victorious, it reinforced the message. Nowhere is safe, no defensive position is secure. Accept combat on our terms or die running. That message, delivered repeatedly over hundreds of missions, shattered German tactical cohesion more effectively than any technical advantage could have achieved. The young American pilots who executed these dives, many barely 20 years old, weren't motivated by hatred or ideology. Most interviewed after the war described their actions in purely tactical terms. They dove through flak because their commanders told them to, because it worked, and because they trusted that the odds favored their survival more often than not. The aggregate effect of those individual decisions was the systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe's ability to defend German airspace. Captain Walter Beckham survived the war with 18 confirmed victories. In a 1991 interview conducted shortly before his death, he was asked if he'd ever regretted diving through flak to engage German fighters. His response captured the essential nature of what American fighter pilots had done. Regret would imply I had a choice. I didn't. The Germans were there. They needed to be killed. The flak was just weather. You fly through weather to reach your target. That's what we did. Every time. Until there were no more Germans left to chase. The Americans didn't win air superiority over Europe because they were better pilots than the Germans. They won because they were willing to be more aggressive, accept higher costs, and pursue enemy fighters into areas where traditional doctrine said survival was impossible. They proved that in industrial warfare, sustainability matters more than skill, and that tactics which preserve individual lives can lose wars against opponents willing to spend lives to achieve strategic objectives. That remains perhaps the hardest lesson of aerial combat. Sometimes courage means accepting death as probable and fighting anyway. The Americans learned that lesson. The Germans never could. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.